versus conduct that was prompted by a brain disorder like schizophrenia, where you're having auditory hallucinations, for example.
Right. This is such an interesting distinction and such an important one, I think, which is how do we separate people who are actually suffering from mental illness from people who simply have a very strange worldview that allows them to act on aggressive impulses, right? And, there's this great line that Justice Kennedy wrote in the case of Panetti versus Quarterman, which was a case that went up to the Supreme Court on competency to be executed and what that standard should be. It's a 2007 case. And he makes this nice distinction between, he says, and I'm just going to read from the case because I think it's really helpful. The beginning of doubt about competence in a case like Petitioner's is not a misanthropic personality or an amoral character. It's a psychotic disorder. And I think that really captures what you and I have been concerned about, which is how do we make sure we don't lump in people who have severe mental illness with people like who join ISIS and think there's something appropriate about throwing gay men off of a building, right? How do we make these distinctions? And I think this is where we make it, which is when the person has been diagnosed with a severe mental illness, that usually constitutes some kind of a break with reality, right? So they're hearing voices, they have really confused thought processes, and they're actually diagnosable and often treatable with medication, right? That's a lot different from somebody who just hates a group of people for a skewed view of the world. And I think it's one that we really have to stick tightly to. One is a disease process. The other one is a worldview that we do not recognize as legitimate.
One of the difficulties, and I just want to make it clear. First of all, I want to clarify, I misspoke. I said North Carolina, it's South Carolina, where the Charleston shooting took place. I'm not condoning by any stretch of the imagination Dylann Roof's worldview or the conduct. Certainly, it's horrible, it's abhorrent. Trying to tease out, though, the legal analysis, the psychoanalytical underpinnings of the conduct. Is it worth having this discussion in your view, Professor Moriarty, or is this something that we're spending too much time on?
Not at all. I think we have to understand the purpose of incarceration, the purpose of punishment, the concept of retribution, the concept of setting an example if we are going to use the law properly, right? With as the Supreme Court sometimes has said, or certain members of the Supreme Court, for example, executing an insane person does not stop someone else from committing a crime, right? Unlike, for example, if we're going to have we're going to have capital punishment, and we look at the case in Boston, we think, well, maybe if we're going to have it, that's the proper case for it. But executing somebody who committed a murder while fully delusional doesn't serve any real purpose for the justice system. So I think what we need to do is really distinguish sharply between a worldview that from some misguided self-deception allows you to act aggressively and violently, from a severe mental illness over which many people have no control or they don't even know they have, which changes their understanding of reality in a very profound way. One is, if you look at Dylann Roof, for example, and he's out trolling on the internet, he's actually looking for information that supports this worldview, right? If you look at, for example, the fellow in the case of Panetti versus Quarterman, I mean, this is a guy who suffered from psychosis, who had severe delusions about angels and demons, And it was a mental illness, and he was on a great deal of antipsychotic medication to even be able to be competent to be tried. Nothing we've seen here with people who are simply pursuing a racist manifesto would suggest they suffer from a mental illness. And so I think this is really important to talk about. And I think it's really important we don't lump people with mental illnesses in with people who have really violent worldviews.
Let me tease this out, and this may be getting way down in the weeds. There's been some research by psychologists, social psychologists, one of whom I interviewed last week, that talks about the idea of, with respect to African Americans and the overall stress involved with the idea of simply being a member of a minority group, and in this case, as it applies to being African American, to being in a group that is pressured from a number of different sources, societal, educational, in your neighborhood, where you work, where you live. And it's been grouped under the heading of GAD, general anxiety disorder. And there are reputable academicians and clinicians who are kicking around the idea of the effects of this generalized level, increased level of stress among not just African Americans, but any individuals who find themselves in an underrepresented group, given where they work, where they live, and the correlation between that type of increased stress and increased maladies, heart disease, stress-related disorders, and the like. So my question has to do with, even if you have a worldview where you feel like you are being persecuted, whether or not it's real or not, your mind doesn't make the distinction between whether or not the information that it's perceiving is actually accurate. It just knows that you feel stressed, right?
Right.
So if indeed an individual with one of these extreme views has adopted this worldview, has, as you mentioned, sought out information and is affiliating themselves with groups who are telling them, yeah, it's really bad out there. We're under siege. We're endangered. We're under attack. Notwithstanding rational evidence and competent evidence to the contrary, aren't we in the same place effectively? We have an individual, potentially and effectively, an individual who has a belief system, a reinforced belief system, feels the real stressors, develops some sort of psychosis at some point as a result of that, and then goes off and does some really horrific stuff.
Well, see, so you've added an interesting little nugget in here, James, which is developed psychosis. I mean, that's a big development, right? You don't really develop psychosis just because you're immersed in a in a chat room for a couple of months. People develop psychosis as a result of an underlying medical disorder. I don't know how they develop it in a psychiatrist or an MD, but we know it's different from what happens to other people. And, I think it's really important to distinguish between things like stress and what you've termed a general anxiety disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, which we often see, and psychosis. These are really different kinds of mental illnesses, we know. One is more like a garden variety virus, such as general anxiety disorder. Psychosis is a really serious, lifelong mental disorder that people develop, that they take very heavy-duty antipsychotic medication for. So, even if you think about people who are exposed to a great deal of stress, it doesn't mean they become psychotic, right? Very few of them become psychotic. I don't know that there's a relationship between stress and psychosis. But I think there's a difference here, which is mental illness, serious mental illness such as schizophrenia, is found at every level of society. It seems to have some genetic component, as I understand it. We don't really know why it develops in some people and not in others. But, whereas people who might live in a very dangerous neighborhood my guess is everyone feels scared, and everybody develops some level of anxiety if if you have a brain in your head, right? Because you know it's dangerous. And I think we need to keep that distinction fairly sharp. What's really different is what I guess the law calls your sort of understanding of right and wrong. It seems as though if we look at Dylann Roof as an example, he somehow had this vision of himself as being the crusader. He was, everybody talks about it, but I'm going to go do something about it. His worldview was skewed, but it doesn't sound. He said he had to be brave. I think he knew what was going to happen after he committed this crime. He seemed to understand that. What I think is really interesting is he decided it was too dangerous to go to the ghetto, as he put it, and shoot people. So instead he went to a church where he wouldn't get shot at back. So to me, that's pretty rational behavior, to the degree any of this is rational. But it seems to me a long distance from the people we look at who really have things like schizophrenia and serious mental illness.
Tease out for us, and I just want to keep you for just a few more moments, the distinctions between what an individual in Dylann Roof's situation would be facing on the state level as compared to on the federal level with respect to mental illness, or with respect to an insanity defense and the different standards that apply there.
Okay, well, the insanity defense in South Carolina has this. It doesn't require a, quote, severe mental disease or defect. It just says as a result of mental disease or defect, and you must show that the defendant lacked capacity to distinguish moral or legal right from moral or legal wrong. That word moral I haven't seen in other statutes, I have to say. Or to recognize the particular act charged as morally or legally wrong. So that insertion of the phrase moral or legal certainly gives some wiggle room, I think, probably to Roof's counsel to sort of explore an insanity defense. And the defendant he bears the burden of proving this by a preponderance of the evidence, which, as you know, being a lawyer, means that, one grain of sand tilts the seesaw one way or the other. It's a very light burden. It's just, more likely than not. Under the federal standard, which is what we call IDRA, the Insanity Defense Reform Act, which was enacted, by the way, after the shooting of Ronald Reagan, and is a more difficult standard to meet. First of all, it requires a severe mental disease or defect. And it says that the defendant was unable to appreciate the nature and quality of the wrongfulness of his acts. It's a harder standard, a narrower gate to get through than I think the South Carolina one, at least slightly. Secondly, the burden is by clear and convincing evidence, which again, as a lawyer, is a much higher standard than preponderance. It's somewhere between beyond a reasonable doubt and preponderance, but it's a very hard standard to meet. When the Insanity Defense Reform Act was enacted in the mid-'80s, it was meant to ratchet back the availability of the insanity defense. Most states followed along with that general trend and narrowed their insanity defense. But even having said that, I don't think, well, first of all, almost no one is successful with an insanity defense, as you and I both know. Something like 0.1% of people raise it successfully in a criminal trial. Most defendants don't want to raise it because they don't want to be labeled mentally ill. And additionally, we also have what's called the guilty but mentally ill standard in most states, including South Carolina, which juries are far more comfortable with, finding a defendant guilty but mentally ill. Ronald Reagan had this line that was quoted in the newspaper about, there's something wrong, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, about a person who admits to doing the crime and then claims he was mentally ill and shouldn't be punished. And I think that's the view